I just had the pleasure of talking to Paul Levy and Brodie Gregory, authors of Using Feedback in Organizational Consulting, the first book in the Fundamentals of Consulting Psychology series. They are a blast. I mean, this was just so much fun. You'll love watching this episode just because it's really a good conversation as well as informative about authoring, about delivering feedback about the book, about the series, all sorts of things. They are just so much fun to talk to. Some really good tips on giving feedback, and especially in today's virtual world and how we're dealing with things now. They have a couple of supplementary tips from what's already in their book. So I hope you enjoy this episode. So I am very excited here to have Paul Levy and Brodie Gregory, who are authors of Using Feedback in Organizational Consulting. And I'm going to ask them several questions about how it was to write the book and what they're doing, how they got together and all that. So first off, I'd like to introduce both of you and just say hi. And why don't you say a few words about yourself? How about Paul? Why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Joanie. Hi, Brodie.
Hi, Paul.
I am a professor of psychology at the University of Akron. Currently, right now, I'm in a new position. I am the vice president and chief of staff for President Miller at the University of Akron. And I'm an industrial organizational psychologist who has specialized in feedback and performance management.
Thanks. Okay. And Brodie, what about you?
Thank you, Joanie. Like Paul, I am also an industrial organizational psychologist. I spend most of my time working in the field of leadership development. So I have my own coaching and consulting practice. I spend about 40% of my time as an executive coach working one-on-one with leaders. And then I do various and sundry interesting consulting projects. I'm also a part-time professor at Georgetown University. And before jumping off a cliff and going off on my own, I did some corporate time at Procter & Gamble, Corporate Executive Board, and McKinsey and Company. And I'm very proud to say that Paul is my PhD advisor. And that's probably why we're here today. It was the beginning of a many-year-long collaboration that still continues.
Well, excellent. That's really interesting to know. So you two kept in touch. How did you come together to write the book? I mean, what were you doing that got you to write the book on feedback?
So, Brodie, where were you at the time? Were you at
Where
McKinsey?
do we start? No, I think I was at CEB.
Oh, maybe.
At the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I feel like the story begins even before that. Like when I walked into your office and we were talking about what I was going to focus my master's research on, and I was all over the place. I was like, physiological markers of stress, work-life balance, gender things, this and that, and this and that. And you said, well, I focus on performance management and feedback. And I think that's where it all began, Paul.
Okay, so perhaps I provided a little bit of structure early in your career.
Thank goodness. But yes, if we then fast forward to, 2012 or 2013, I think that's when Rodney approached us with the opportunity to write this book, which was the first in the APA Fundamentals of Consulting Psychology series. It was such an honor.
Yep.
Right. So did he approach you simultaneously, or did you two choose each other? How did that come up?
I think he approached Brodie, and Brodie called me and said, hey, we need to do this. And I said, what? What do we need to do? And she said, we need to write this book on feedback. And I said, Brodie, I'm really busy. And she said, yeah, but we have to do this. I'll take the lead. And I said, okay, fine. Is that how you remember it?
Well, my memory is a little hazy. I was actually going to say the opposite, but this is a great illustration of how faulty memory is. I was going to say Rodney asked you, and then you asked me if I would write it with you.
Oh,
we're going to have to get the third party in here.
We need to phone a friend to call Rodney. But can I tell my other favorite Rodney story while we're talking about it?
Please, yeah, let's do it.
Rodney was the editor at consulting psych journal back in, I think it was like 2006, when Paul and I, and we had one other co-author, Micah, submitted a manuscript, and Rodney was the one who accepted it. It was my first ever publication. So Rodney accepted my first ever peer-reviewed publication. I have great, great gratitude to Rodney for that. And then this gem.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was looking for a juicier story, but no, I'll accept that one.
Paul might have one.
Sorry, Rodney.
No, I don't have anything juicy. I've known Rodney for a while, but yeah, nothing juicy.
No, I don't have any either, except for wonderful praise for him. So this book was in 2015 is when it was published. How long did it take you to write it? You know, how were you doing that with all of the different work that both of you do? How did you find time to write the book and collaborate on a book at that?
Go ahead, Brodie.
Well, my recollection is that we waited until the last minute. I think we got to the last few months before it was due. We had made outlines and everything, and then it was a real crunch. I think the great thing about it, though, was that Paul and I had already had many years of experience collaborating and writing together. We had written a number of other book chapters and journal articles, which really gave us a head start because I think we knew how to collaborate well together and had a good process, which enabled us to write the book in a relatively short time frame.
And I think the structure of the book was kind of obvious for us. I think we didn't struggle with how we wanted to lay it out. It was just the writing. And I can remember sitting here, I'm in my home office tonight, and reading over chapters and making edits and going back and forth with emails and that sort of thing, which is pretty typical, I think.
Well, so why don't you tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about what the book is about, maybe a couple of takeaways.
You want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I would say one of our first goals with the book was to bring together and synthesize a lot of the excellent research that has been done on feedback, everything from feedback orientation, feedback environment, and elements of context, what makes or breaks how people hear and receive feedback, whether or not they accept it, qualities of the feedback provider and the way that they deliver their feedback and how that impacts the other person's experience. So there's so much great research out there, and our goal was to pull it together, synthesize it, and make it pretty application focused, with the intended audience being consulting psychologists. So how can you take all of these feedback best practices that we know from research and apply them in the work that you're doing, whether you are a consultant, if you work internally in an organization in an HR capacity, if you're doing work on performance management or in leadership development, and how can you weave some of those feedback best practices into the work that you're doing? Paul, what would you add?
Yeah, I would just second that and say we really wanted to make it more approachable for folks who don't live in the academic world where I've lived for a long time, but also wanted to make sure that what we were saying in here was based on the research and strongly based on the research, so that we kind of start out that way with sort of a couple of key pieces in the beginning chapter to sort of lay it out quickly, move through it, and then get to how we kind of see those things being applied in the real world. So I would, kind of second that.
Yeah, this is one of the books that has like creases in it and little Post-its and stuff in it, because I refer to it a lot.
That's the greatest compliment we could
receive.
Thank
That's
you.
a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I love that it is research-based, because that's definitely my approach, is always to make sure that I'm using, valid, reliable, researched techniques. And I mean, it's also very practical. It gives you tips on, what to do, what the context is, how people differ, all sorts of things. And so I thought it was a great balance of the two. Kudos to the two of you for doing that.
Thank you.
Very useful. I was curious though. I mean, let's see, 2015, it's not that long ago. Is there anything that's come out since? I mean, especially in the research or otherwise, or what's changed that you might, add to it or revise?
I think the world of work has changed. I mean, I think That's probably the biggest element, I would think, is with COVID. Things have changed and they're not going to go back to the same. It's not going to go back to what we saw before in terms of normal. It's going to be different. I hate that phrase, new normal, but it is going to be a new normal. So I would say that's the biggest change. Brodie?
Yeah, and I think as part of that, the way that people approach and use feedback has had to change, or it's just getting neglected as a result. I talk to a lot of clients who, now that so much of their collaboration and interaction with colleagues is virtual, they miss a lot of the in-between moments. We just jump from Zoom call to Zoom call, hang up, go to your next one. And you don't have 5 minutes when you walk from a meeting room back to your office, or you're commuting from the client back to the airport, to have some of those just-in-time feedback conversations and sort of debrief what just happened in your meeting or a conversation that you just had. And so as a result, people either don't give the feedback or they have to set up what feels like more formal time to have that feedback conversation. And my sort of personal bias is I feel like the more real time and the less formal a feedback conversation can feel, the more comfortable it is, and usually the more productive it is. The more formality and structure you have to put around sitting down and we're going to have a feedback conversation, I think it feels a lot more daunting to both the giver and the receiver. And so I think that's one thing, to Paul's point, that the way that we are working has really impacted the way that people exchange feedback.
Yeah, I think sometimes anticipating feedback is worse than the actual feedback. When
Absolutely.
someone tells you and then they're telling you, we're going to schedule our meeting in 2 weeks. You're like, oh no.
Exactly. You got it. And then by then you've forgotten what happened. You're probably less motivated to do something about it. Yeah. I think another thing that has changed that probably plays a little bit of a role in here is the role of technology in feedback. I think there's probably a lot more use of things like texting or email to share feedback in absence of those moments, which is nice because it can be more timely, but it's probably also less thoughtful. And we're seeing this a lot of growth in digital tools for HR, some of which include feedback features, some very formal, capturing feedback for things like performance management processes, others meant to motivate the exchange of casual, informal feedback and empower people to ask for feedback from others.
Yeah, I think technology is a big piece because of the various platforms that are out there. And isn't it funny? We talked about how the anticipating feedback is the worst and the formality of it. But outside of work, we don't do it that way. I mean, we don't set up a time with our spouse and share feedback at that time. We share it in real time as we're interacting and doing things. But in the workplace, we haven't always done that. And I think we need to. And I think that's why the more informal day-to-day kind of feedback is, I would argue, even more important than that formal performance appraisal feedback that comes once a year, twice a year if we're lucky, right?
Well, it sounds like those are some fundamental aspects of feedback that need to be considered no matter how we're doing this and what technology, or if it's remote or in person, we need to figure those out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about the timeliness of feedback, and Joanie, to your point, scheduling meeting 2 weeks later. So many things go wrong the longer you wait. The person who's giving the feedback, their memory of it has faded. They're not going to have great recall. The person who's receiving the feedback, it's probably faded in their memories. And it never feels good when someone's waited that long. It doesn't feel like it's that important. And you may have missed opportunities to act on that feedback and course correct and integrate it into your work in those 2 weeks that have passed. So timeliness is so important. When I talk to clients about this, I always say the only reason to wait is if you're in a public setting, wait so you can be in private. And if it's highly emotionally charged, wait until emotions have cooled off a little bit. But that's it. Otherwise, have it as soon as you can and before it turns into a big deal.
I like that. 1-2 sort of test there. And I feel like sometimes when you're in these giant Zoom meetings, you don't want to do it in front of the whole team there. But also, do a little sort of litmus test on yourself as well as the other person, right? To make sure that they can hear it as well as you're in a position to deliver it in a constructive way according to the suggestions you have in your book and the research.
Right. Yeah.
Paul, you actually did some really interesting research on what happens to people when they receive feedback in public.
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting. I mean, I think the privacy nature is really important, and I think the social cues are really important. And what I think matters most, and I've talked about this for years, is the context. I mean, feedback takes place in a context, and relationships exist in a context. So, we might say, here's the feedback. Well, that's great, but the way I deliver it to Brodie is going to be different than the way I deliver it to someone with whom I have a different relationship. So I think the context really matters, and the climate. We have a construct that we worked on and developed called the feedback environment, and a measure of that kind of deals with the feedback climate, the extent to which it's delivered well, it comes from a credible source, you get positive feedback and negative feedback, the availability of the source, the credibility of the source, all those sorts of things are really important, and they define what we call the feedback environment, which is sort of a climate for feedback. And I mean, one thing that I have seen over the years is, man, does that vary across organizations, and even within organizations across departments. So I think that really matters. And then I think that impacts how people deal with the feedback, how they respond to the feedback, the extent to which they use the feedback. And what it also impacts is the relationship. And then it becomes sort of this thing that keeps evolving, hopefully in a positive way, depending on what that climate is like.
Well, just to put a plug in for the book, this is all dealt with in the book. I mean, there's a whole chapter on context, right? So so it's definitely a good read. But just also thinking about how it affects the relationship. That's interesting too. Thinking about as the feedback giver, right? Like what's going to happen once you've delivered this feedback? How is that going to change things for you, perhaps in a positive or negative way, right?
And sometimes you won't deliver the feedback because you don't want the repercussions of how it's going to affect the relationship. Oh, she's going to be mad at me. Okay, well, but the feedback didn't get delivered then, and that's not helping either. So you kind of struggle with those sorts of things too.
Yeah, it's complex. It's complex. So I was just curious, after, like, in writing this book or after writing this book, if any new or unexpected opportunities have come up for you, either in your work or in writing, or how's that happened?
I don't know. I mean, this book fit very easily into my research program.
Yeah.
So this was kind of another piece to that, albeit a more practical piece. And Brodie brought a lot of the practical aspects to it, and made me think outside my little ivory tower a little more than perhaps I would have normally done.
Wait, I need to interrupt. Like, so you don't give feedback at the ivory tower? No, there's no feedback given?
Well, ivory tower doesn't always do everything as well as it needs to.
As one of Paul's former grad students,
here we go.
I can attest to the generosity of his feedback giving. And he follows all of his own advice. I never had a shortage of feedback when I was in grad school, especially on work that we were doing together. So, I guess it takes different forms, right? Comments on a Word document, having a conversation about progress, all great forms of feedback. And I can't imagine doing all that work without it.
But also, you also would come looking for it.
Oh, yeah.
Which not everybody does.
True.
Right? That's a piece of it too. It's hard to give feedback to people who, and this kind of gets to the other piece where I've done a lot of research, which is the feedback orientation, which is more the individual difference piece, the receptivity to feedback. We all know feedback, or people who, when you say, I have some feedback for you, they run from your office. Versus people who are like, give me more. I want all the feedback you can give me. Well, that's an individual difference. And that's going to impact things as well. But I mean, Brodie raised that, and it's a good point. I mean, she would come and seek out feedback, and I'd be happy to give it. Other graduate students maybe didn't get as much feedback because they didn't come looking for it. I think that's an important piece too.
It makes a lot of sense, but I was sort of digressing here and interrupting you from what you were saying there, Paul, about
in your
any other
ivory tower
opportunities that come up for you. I didn't know if you had more you wanted to add. It falls within your research program, generally speaking, in what you do. So that was good. Anything different, or maybe for you, Brodie?
Yeah, I've done a lot of stuff. Well, let's see. Let me reframe that. I've done a lot of stuff. I think writing this book together opened a lot of really interesting doors. So at the time I was at CEB, I was actually at PDRI, and then we were acquired by CEB. So it was part of that nesting doll family. And I actually got quite a few clients in my work at PDRI because of the book. People would read it and they'd say, we want your help on performance management work. At PDRI, I was doing a lot of exciting work on performance management with Elaine Polakos and Rose Hansen. And so the book was actually really additive to the work that we were doing there. And I think, one thing that's been really important to me in my applied career is staying close to the research and still having opportunities to do things like write and collaborate with people who are still at universities. And I think that this has created some other opportunities for collaboration. Paul and I were doing some work we had a really cool random team of people doing work on forward-looking feedback a few years ago. It was Paul, a grad student at Akron, another Paul Levy disciple who's at the College of New Jersey, and Ali O'Malley. And the five of us were all doing some research together.
Yeah. As I think about it, one thing that I did do differently is in my graduate class on performance management is I started using the book as sort of the overarching piece for the first half of the class, which is feedback. And it was nice to be able to say, okay, just go read this book. And now we're going to look at some of the research articles, but we don't have to look at as much of them because we were able to kind of summarize things in the book. And the students really responded well to that, really responded well, especially the master students who are coming in, doing 2 years of work, and then going out into the field. And that was really helpful for them. So in that sense, I think the book played a nice role in my class.
Well, that's great. And that's great to get the feedback from the students in the class too, right? They're not complaining about the book. They were actually happy to have it.
Right. Now, maybe they wouldn't complain to my face. Who knows? Right. But yeah, no, they seem to like it.
Huh. Yeah, another use for the book is a textbook. Absolutely. Well, what about writing? Are you writing, you've talked about articles and other research. Do you have any other books in the plan or a follow-up, or what are you working on?
Well, I've actually had 2 other books come out in the meantime. What about you, Paul?
Let's hear a plug. What are they?
Let's see.
Go ahead, Brodie.
Well, here's one. I have this here because I'm giving it to a client tomorrow. This just came out in November. It's called The Coaching Shift.
Right.
And I co-authored this with Shauna Waters. Shauna works at BetterUp. And Shauna and I co-teach a class on coaching skills at Georgetown University in the HR Master's Program. And this was the book we've always wanted for our class, but didn't exist. And we had the opportunity to write it.
So just like Paul, you've got one now that you actually wrote that you can use.
Yeah, exactly. And we just started our first class, a new semester, first time using the book in class. And it's a ton of fun. So Paul, I understand.
Yeah, it is. It is fun. Mine's a little different. So I have a textbook that industrial organizational psych textbook that I think came out in 2003, and it's in the 6th edition now, and the 7th edition is starting to happen. There it is.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that one. Yep.
That's the 6th edition. The 7th edition is going to have a couple additional authors, one of whom happens to be on this call, and it's not you, Joanie. So we will be continuing, and Ali O'Malley, another one of my former students, will be working on the book, because with my new position as chief of staff, I just don't have the time. So I will work with them and edit, and I have a grad student here who's working with us, but it's going to be fun, but it's also going to be different because I've written this by myself for 20 years, I guess.
Now we're going to come and stick all our fingers in it. Actually, let me tell you another story about how our work came to be that relates to the textbook. So I'm a junior in college, aimless, no idea what I'm going to do with my life, but I love psychology, so I'm a psychology major. I go to this guest speaker talk at school. It just so happens to be Paul Levy, who is also an alumnus of the same university, coming to talk about IO psychology. When I walked into that talk, let's say it was at 3 p.m. When I walked into that talk at 3 p.m., I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. When I walked out of that talk at 4 p.m., I knew I wanted to be an IO psychologist. So that was the first time I met Paul. And then Paul and I both went to a very small university. The psychology department at the time didn't offer IO psychology. And so one of my professors offered to do an independent study with me. And we read Paul's textbook together. And that was basically my first IO psychology class. And then when it came time to go to grad school, I was like, well, I'm going to go to Akron and work with Paul. And I didn't apply anywhere else, which was really dumb. And luckily, it worked out.
And it worked out quite well.
Thank you.
This is testament that you're here today talking about it after you've written together and you have another book coming out together. Yeah, that's fantastic.
And that was probably 21 years ago.
Wow.
It's old enough to drink now, our relationship.
Your relationship.
Old enough to drink. I think that about sums it up.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to add that I haven't asked you about? I mean, about your book or writing together or about the series or encouraging others to consider authoring or giving feedback, consulting, whatever, anything.
Absolutely. I am so grateful that we had the opportunity to partner on this book. In addition to having a great time writing with Paul, just the overall experience of working as part of this series was really positive. It was so seamless and easy, collaborative and supportive from like point A to the end of the project. And then even since then too. I recently caught up with Ross, who I think you recently interviewed. He just wrote another book in the series, and we were talking a little bit about our experience. And so I would absolutely encourage listeners who are interested in writing something and contributing to the series to give it a serious think and reach out and learn more about it, because it's a great series. I think the topics are unique and kind of fulfill interesting, untouched niches with each one that comes out. And so I just can't wait to see more.
And I would just add too that I would give that same encouragement to academics. It was fun to be able to step out and not be writing for journals and dealing with all the things that happen. And that's a big part of my career, and it's been good, but it was nice to be able to step back and take all of that and write it in a way that you know it's going to be used by folks, and more, like we talked about earlier, a little more approachable. And I agree, it was an easy process. The folks that we worked with made it easy. We just kind of rolled through things. It was very organized. It was timely, except for us, because we got started late.
But we still finished on time.
We got it done in time. We just started late. But yeah, it was a really good process.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, your experiences, and just yourselves with us today. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you both, Paul and Brodie.
Likewise,
Absolutely.
Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us to do this. It was a ton of fun, and we appreciate it.
And we're always looking for an opportunity for Brodie and I to chat. So this